Hey, I want to welcome you back to Open the Book. And we've been going through the book of First John together, and we've got up to chapter 2, verse 7 now. So we're just going to take another 4 verses and go through those together, see what John's saying to us. And what I've called it is same old, same old. And what we're going to see here is John trying to make the point of what the gospel's doing and what the gospel's looking to produce in us as fruit is consistent, that there's a continuity between what Jesus has done in the gospel and everything that's always been taught throughout the Old Testament scriptures. So he wants to kind of make that point of what the gospel's doing here. It's not to be seen as something that's gone against everything that's always been spoken about. Wants you to see Jesus as a fulfillment of everything that's been seen before. So it's a case of same old, same old. Let's get to these verses then. Let's read from verse 7 here down to verse 11. He says, "Beloved, I'm writing to you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you've had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you've heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes." So let's just look at those first 2 verses there, verse 7 and 8, and see what he's doing, because we can split that passage there. If we just go back a second there, 7 to 11, right in two there. Verses 7 to 8 fit together as one point. And then from verse 9, 10, and 11, that's then a bit of a second point that he's making there. And they both fit together. So firstly, he's saying, "Beloved, I'm writing to you no new commandment." And that was the thing we were saying there, that this is nothing new. The gospel isn't teaching something. What he means by that is that is inconsistent or breaking continuity with the Old Testament, is fulfilling it. Jesus says this himself. He says this, that, I haven't come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill it. And he'll make the point even stronger by saying, look, I tell you, not even one iota will pass from it. Iota was the little name of, in the Greek language, the New Testament is written, and it was really the language of the world at the time in which Jesus lived. Iota was the name of the dot above an I, the smallest mark in the language. Not even one dot is going to pass from it. I haven't come to abolish it. I've come as its fulfillment. And John is picking up that kind of idea. He's saying, what I'm writing to you is no new commandment, but an old commandment. It's two ways of saying the same thing. It's not new, it's old. No new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. This word, you might not necessarily see this just there at first, but one of the things is, if you read John's gospel, and we've been doing that as a church at the minute, and if you haven't been following that along, just been joining these videos, I encourage you maybe to do that, because you'll see a lot of common ground here. John borrows a lot of language and ideas from his gospel, and he certainly does that in these few verses here. He says, this is no new commandment, it's an old commandment that you had from the beginning. One of the things I think he's doing here is referencing the very, very beginning of the Bible, the very first words, literally, of the Bible, that in the beginning, God. He's saying, this is no new commandment, it's an old commandment. In fact, this is consistent with everything that God has said and everything that God has shown us from the very beginning of time. That Jesus is consistent and in continuity with all of that. And you can say it again, the old commandment. Whoops, that was bad there. Never mind. The old commandment is the word that you've heard. John's being clear here. in a second what this is about. The old commandment is the word that you've heard. He's linking, the old commandment, everything that was taught you all throughout the course of the Old Testament. He's writing primarily to kind of people from a Jewish background who, most of them, at least, come to faith as well. But, struggling and wrestling with that idea of, well, we've been brought up through all of this stuff. So how do we make sense of Jesus in light of the Old Testament? Is he just completely doing away with all of that stuff, or what's going on here? And John's point is, no, he's not doing away with it. He's a fulfillment of it. You need to read the Old Testament in the light of Jesus, and you'll see what it's really, truly saying to you when you read it in the light of Jesus coming. He's saying this old commandment that you've had here in the past is the word. He's linking the two there. And the word he means there is the message of the gospel that he's been putting out to people through his gospel and encouraging people to believe and to live out in his letter here. The old commandment is the word that you've heard. So it's an old thing. It's a thing you've known for a very long time. And yet, John is almost seemingly now going to contradict himself, because he's going to say, at the same time, there's a paradox here. Two things that seem to be opposite, working together, but actually not contradicting one another. Paradox. At the same time, it is a new commandment. It is old, but it is new. There's something different that has happened with the coming of Jesus and with the gospel. There's a new detail and fleshing out of everything that it means. So let's think about this a little bit, because this is an important idea, actually. How can it be both old and new? So there's this idea that throughout the Old Testament era, when we see, God moving amongst his people there, that there is a progressive nature of revelation. What do I mean by that? What that means is that gradually more and more is being revealed about how God is going to save people. The gospel that God is going to save people from sin, from Satan, from death, and return them to him, is always there. From Genesis 3 onwards, and the very first way that it's put is that there will be a son who comes from the line of Eve. There will be a human born who is going to crush the head of the serpent, the one who tricked humanity into rebelling against God. Is going to crush him in his opposition and return God's people to him. The gospel is always there, but the detail gradually increases. So that at the very beginning, the gospel message in essence is trust God to save you. So say, for example, Noah is recorded by Peter in his letter as being a herald of righteousness, a preacher of righteousness. What does that mean? Because did Noah know specifically about Jesus being born in Bethlehem, growing up in Nazareth, working as a carpenter most of his life, and yet, whilst being man, also being the Son of God, who would, through him, would offer himself as a perfect sacrifice in our place for sin, that would make us right before God, and that would enable us to become his children? Does Noah know all of that detail? No. And we certainly have no record of any sermons, as you might think, in the Old Testament records there. So how is he a preacher of righteousness? Because we also know as well that whilst being counted righteous by God, he's not perfect. He makes mistakes. He, not very long after getting out of the boat from the flood, and the world's been almost in many ways, reset, recreated, he goes and makes a mess of things. He gets drunk and naked. His sons see him, and his shame is put out for all to see. He's not perfect, but he's counted righteous by God. How is he a preacher of righteousness? Well, and what was his message? Well, I think his message surely would have been as simple as turn away from sin. The reason that God floods the earth is the sin of mankind. Turn away from sin, turn back to God, and trust him to be your savior, your deliverer, your provider, your king, by getting on the boat and avoiding the flood. I think that would be as simple as what his message was. Turn away from sin, turn to God, trust him to save you, get on the boat. That's at that point what it meant to trust God. Now, at that point, they don't have all the details of how this is going to play out in history exactly. But to believe and to follow God in that moment, to truly follow the gospel at that point meant turn from sin, turn to God, trust him to deliver you, get on the boat. But over the course of the Old Testament, the detail fleshes out. So it's a bit like a dimmer switch on your lights, that gradually that just fades in and the light becomes clearer and clearer and brighter. This is a new commandment. Things have now fleshed out in so much more detail than we've ever seen before. So he says, this is at the same time a new commandment I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing. Number one there, darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Number two. And John is referencing back to his gospel here. The darkness is passing, the darkness of sin, the curse upon the earth as a result of it, the death and decay that we see as a result of the world breaking and starting to fall apart at the seams. The darkness is passing. Why is it passing? The two are connected. Why does the darkness pass? Because the true light is already shining. Notice the tense there as well. I'm going to get a little bit technical now there, that this is present continuous, is passing. It's going forward. It's happening now and going forward. Oops. And not stopping. We haven't seen it fully yet. It's just passing. It hasn't passed away yet. It's passing away. And the true light is already shining. Again, present continuous. It's happening now. The light is shining. Jesus has come. The light is now shining in the darkness. But we haven't yet seen his second coming, his return. So there is still some more glory to come and a fullness of Jesus' salvation, not only for us, but also for the earth around us, to be remade, renewed, restored, recreated. The darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. And he's pointing back to his gospel. So if we go back to John, this is Mark here. So this is about the commandments, and this is Jesus teaching it, saying, what are those commandments here? And he's saying to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor. And John's going to come on to this. This is what the essence of really what it will mean now to really believe the gospel in your heart and it to affect your life, is to love God with all that you have, and as a result to also love your neighbor as yourself. You'll come back to that in a moment. But here he's referring back to his gospel here. The darkness is passing. The true light is already shining. We'll see that again as he comes back to these last three verses here. Let's skip ahead there to verse 9. It says, whoever says he's in the light, and remember that in the past couple of sessions where we've looked at this, we've looked at him talking about this. Nobody can say that they're in the light but walk in the darkness. Everybody who still sins or sins but claims they don't have any sin is really in the darkness. They haven't really come to see the truth at all, because if you come to see the truth of the gospel, you come to see a need for Jesus, that that you do have a problem of sin in your life and you want that to change, and so you want to walk in the light. You want to walk differently. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in the darkness. You can't say you believe the gospel but then hate your brother, your sister. And what he means here is, not just your family, although, that can be hard enough at times, I suppose, can't it? We see that in different families, don't we? The Gallagher brothers, for example, the Davis brothers of the Kinks as well, siblings who fall out, and maybe sometimes there's not even ever a kind of reconciliation. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in the darkness. What it means is you can't really say that you're walking in the light but then hate other believers. The brothers and sisters, really, we could put there. You're still in the darkness if you do that. And then he's going to say it in a positive way. There's the negative. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is in the darkness. Put that there. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. So there's a negative and a positive there. Whoever says he's in the light but hates his brother is in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light. Whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. And there you see the trouble of it. You're in the darkness. The same darkness that he's talked about here that is passing. You're choosing to still be in the darkness when actually the true light is already shining. You could be walking in the light, but you are choosing to walk in the dark. And what's the effect of that? You don't know where you're going. And you're blinded. You don't know where you're going. You're stumbling around. It said here, you have no cause for stumbling if you love your brother and sister, Christ. But here you do have cause for stumbling because you are blinded. You're blinded by it. You're blinded by your hate. You continue in the darkness. I was saying it before, he's referring back to his gospel here. John, the very beginning of his gospel here, chapter 1, says, look, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome. He's speaking of Jesus, who's come here, that he comes as the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness hasn't overcome. The light is so bright, it overwhelms the darkness. It's not possible around Jesus for it to be dark, because he's the true light. And says of himself, there's a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light. That same light, Jesus. There it is there, look. That all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Jesus, the word and the light, as he says in the first chapter of his gospel, the true light, again, Jesus, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. And so his point here is, number one, this is both an old and a new commandment. It's old in that it's really the very same as the gospel message has always been, and yet it's new in that there's so much more detail now in Jesus having come and revealed God in all his fullness. So number one, the gospel is consistent with the Old Testament. And number two, to live in the light, you must love one another. If you don't love one another, you're not in the light. The darkness is passing. The true light, Jesus, is already shining. So walk in the light by loving one another. That's his message. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope that you find it helpful. And see you again next time.